Autocracies have always been spectacles of turbulence, violence, rebellion. And that's exactly what we have pictured for us in 1 Kings chapter 1. An autocracy, of course, is a government by which we have a leader at the top, and most of the power resides in the top. And the individuals on the bottom are those simply that are participants in a government, but all the pressure of government is upon them. As a matter of fact, in constitutional studies, we've always likened it to a pyramid. As our founding fathers crafted it, the pyramid is going to be this way, and the leader at the top has very little power. And most of the authority, most of the power is at the bottom, at the base of that pyramid. But always, as time progresses, the pyramid gets turned upside down, and all the power gravitates to the top, and then all the pressures on the bottom. That basically is what happened in our country already. We feel so much pressure from Washington, D.C. because we have allowed, over the last 200 years, or 150 at least, power to gravitate toward the top. And so most decisions now, even in personal lives, are made in Washington, D.C. And so that creates a lot of pressure on the bottom. But more than that, when that is the style of government that takes place, as our founders warned us, it would be to change government, to change direction, would be a huge task. It is not simply changing a few policies or tweaking a few policies. It is absolutely radical changes all the way across the board. And you might think about, for example, after Trump was president, now Biden's president, think about the radical changes that have occurred. Well, that's only a small sampling of those things that are going to continue if we don't have more power on the bottom and less power at the top. But the point of it is, in an autocratic government where there's a king or a queen or a dictatorship, there's always not only power at the top, but that power has a struggle with it, and there is always, of course, bloodshed and rebellion that takes place when there is a change of leadership. And that's always the case. It's really the nature of the case. That exactly is what we have in 1 Kings chapter 1. That is, at least it might be this way. Right now, David is lying on his deathbed. He is incapacitated, as 1 Kings chapter 1 opens up. He is not able to do anything as a king, really. He has a nurse that has come in, Abishag, and warms him. But what's taking place now is Adonija is going to assert himself, one of his sons, to be king. And things look like they're going to go in a turbulent direction. So if you want to see a real picture of it, just go ahead a few chapters in 1 Kings to chapter 16. You might look at chapter 16 and just notice some of the kings' names very quickly. In 1 Kings chapter 12, the kingdom divided. After Solomon died, as you recall, the northern tribes, 10 of them, went with Jeroboam, and 2 of them stayed with the son of Solomon, and that would be Rehoboam in the south. So after the kingdom was divided, in the north, they were not following the regal line of David at all. There was nothing like that at all. There was no law of primogeniture as far as David's line was concerned at all. It had nothing to do with David's line any longer. And every change of power was completely radical. Every change of power was turbulent. Every change of power was violent. For example, in 1 Kings chapter 16, Baasha is a king of the northern tribes, king of Israel. His son Elah takes the throne. Elah reigns 2 years. But there is a cavalry commander by the name of Zimri who wants the throne. And he stages a coup against Elah and murders him. Now he takes the reins of government. Zimri now is in Tirzah. That's the capital. It's not Samaria yet. He's in Tirzah. And Zimri, the cavalry leader, has become the commander and really the king, but asserting himself by murder. But the army is stationed at a place called Gibbethon. And there's one of their captains, one of their leaders by the name of Omri, whom the army prefers to Zimri, and so they support Omri. Omri takes the army, marches against Zimri. Zimri sees that the time is up. He burns the house down on him, and he had only reigned for 7 days. Now, Omri is the leader, but there's still another faction of the army that follows another man by the name of Tibni. So there's wars going to take place in order to consolidate Omri's power. And that's exactly how autocratic governments run. Omri finally wins, and then he moves the capital from Tirzah to Samaria, buys the hill of Shomer, calls it Shomer or Samaria, and he buys it from a particular individual and now makes that the capital city. But the point simply is this: that is a small picture of what takes place when all power is at the top. And that's exactly what might be in the case regarding Adonija and his rebellion against his father David. So let's watch what happens as 1 Kings chapter 1 opens up, and man Adonija decides to assert himself. Adonija, you might recall, was a son of David, the fourth son of David, and he was not really in line for the kingship except as events transpired earlier. Now he is the next one in line. So remember, his first son, David's first son, was Amnon. Amnon had been murdered by his half-brother Absalom. Absalom killed Amnon because Amnon had ravaged his full sister Tamar, Absalom's full sister. So Absalom murders Amnon. You can imagine the turbulence going on in the kingdom because of these events. Now Absalom, he murders Amnon. Now he flees, as we looked earlier, last lesson, he flees to another country, stays there for a while. But when he returns, he himself is killed in battle as he's trying to stage a coup against his father. So now Amnon, gone. The second son, Kileab, is not mentioned anywhere else. We suppose he's already dead. Absalom, David had so much hope for Absalom. He named him Avshalom, my father's peace. That is peace to my father, that is to himself. My father's peace, but he was anything but peaceable to his daddy. Absalom dies, and so the next man in line is named Adonija. Adonijah is meaning the Lord is Jehovah. David named him that because Adonai, the Lord, and Jehovah, put those two names together, you have Adonijah. Adonijah decides it is time to assert his power, time to assert himself as king, and he takes matters into his own hands. His dad is incapacitated on his deathbed, not able to really move at all. There's the nurse that has been hired, Abishag, to care for him, to be his bed warmer, but that's about all that's going on with David. So Adonijah decides that now is the time to assert his authority and become king. And so he calls together individuals that are important political people in the kingdom. One of them is Joab. Remember, Joab is David's nephew. He's the commander-in-chief of all the armies. So Joab is supportive of Adonijah. Next is also a priest, and that priest is Abiathar. Kind of a peculiar situation, but there are two priests, two men serving as high priest at the time, Abiathar and Zadok. Abiathar supports now Adonijah. So you have the priesthood, which is the ecclesiastical segment, as well as the commander-in-chief of the army, Joab, supporting Adonijah, and Adonijah throws a huge party for himself, a coronation ceremony at a place called En Rogel. En Rogel is just south by southeast of Jerusalem. If you look at Jerusalem in your mind's eye, you have the city is actually surrounded by valleys. And the valley on the eastern side is the valley of Kidron. Small brook runs through it. The northern portion of it is called the valley of Jehoshaphat, and it comes down south, comes south of the city. On the western side of the city is the valley of Hinnom. This is why Jerusalem is a great place militarily speaking, because it's set up on a hill and these valleys surround it. So the valley of Hinnom is on the western side, but it comes right down on the bottom, south side, and these two places meet. The confluence of these two places is a large pavilion, apparently, that has been constructed called En Rogel. There's a spring here, and it's a place where they have gone, and apparently there have been festivals that have taken place at En Rogel. There is a cave or several caves in the area. As a matter of fact, David had spies that at one time, when Remember, when he is cast out of Jerusalem by Absalom, his spies stayed at En Rogel. Adonija prepares this huge feast, and he calls all these important heads of state together to crown himself king. And he, of course, is asserting his right of primogeniture. He is the next in line. He does not invite, however, Solomon. Apparently, there was a palace secret, and that was that Solomon would really be the next king. He didn't invite Solomon, and other people he did not invite, and that was an oversight on his part, perhaps purposely regarding Solomon, but the other ones were oversights, and it was going to be his own doom. So what happened was that Adonija now asserts himself, and he shows what he is really about, his character. I want to talk about his character for just a moment. 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 6 gives you a good picture of his character, and it was forged by his own father, David. And the statement is made that David never said to Adonija, "Why are you doing this?" That is to say, that's biblical terminology, to say David never corrected him at all. He never questioned what he was doing. Adonija, like the rest of these boys brought up in a harem, were probably raised by other people, not his own father very much at all. And his father never questioned anything that he did. He was a spoiled individual. There's a statement made in Ecclesiastes by Solomon himself. Solomon says in chapter 8 and verse 4 of that book, that who's going to say to the king, "What are you doing?" That is, who's going to correct a king? Why? Because you're taking your own life into your own hands if you try to correct a king. That's the way autocratic governments work. You're not going to correct a king. And one of the most pitiful situation is when you have children, teenage children, that think they're the kings. And that's exactly what Adonija thought. King of the household, king of the city, and he himself is going to rule it. He has not been constrained by his father in any way. The worst thing that a parent can do is not to control or teach the children the way they should go. There's an important passage in Exodus. It's in the Law of Moses. It's chapter 20, it's verse 12, that tells us that this is the fifth command of the Decalogue: honor thy father and mother, that it may be well with you, and your days may be long upon the earth. What is that to say? Your days may be long upon the earth. That means to say that it will be your social good. It's a social good where children learn respect in the home to the father and mother. So serious was the crime of disrespect that the death sentence was to be enacted for a child who cursed his mother or father. Now you think about that for a moment. The first thing that a child needs to know is honor and respect. If you don't have honor and respect, you don't have the ability to guide. You don't have the ability to direct. You don't have the ability to teach at all. That's exactly what's happening in the public school system. There's no honor. There's no respect. They don't learn it in the home. They're not going to have it in the classroom. That's the first thing. Now, people will always hurry to say, well, a father needs to train with a loving hand. That's true. And I'm not denying that. But the first lesson is, and the primary lesson is, honor and respect are absolutely essential, not only for the well-being of a home, but for the well-being of society. If there's not honor and respect, then we don't have anything except society unraveling. And that's exactly what's happening here. It's exactly what's happening in our own country. Now let's look at that passage that Paul writes where he quotes Exodus 20. That's from Ephesians 6 that Brother Ray read in our hearing a moment ago. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And then he quotes Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12. Honor thy father and mother, that it may be well with thee, and your days may be long upon the earth. That is, it might be society's good. It's a smoothing influence on society with honor and respect. And then the next verse, verse 12, fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. That is not, they're not to discipline in anger. They're not to be people who are throwing their wrath around the house. But the idea is, fathers, train up your children in the way they should go. And that's what we have in Exodus chapter 6, beginning verse 1, all the way through verse 4. Provoke not your children to wrath, but nurture them in the learning and admonition of the Lord. This is exactly what Adonija did not have. And this is exactly why we have major problems right now facing us in 1 Kings 1, as well as in our own society today. So Adonija now plans this feast at En-Rogel. And he's a spoiled man. He's out of control. He respects not man. He respects not his father. He respects not God. Incidentally, let me mention this. Do you know if a child learns respect and honor for his parents, and particularly the father, then that by transference goes to the school system. By transference, it goes to the community and the police. And by transference, it goes to God. Because in the beginning of a child's life, the father really plays the role of God in the family. The child does not know God, but he plays the role of God, the father does. And when a child does not know his father, does not respect his father, we're not going to see people respecting God later. You know what the problem is in our society? This is it. The family breakdown in society, where the government has become the surrogate father for so many people through a welfare system that means there is no respect for a father. There's no respect for dads at all in the home. And that's the problem we have with Adonija. So you can see now beginning what's going to happen. So Adonija has this feast at En-Rogel. He's going to claim himself to be king. And actually begins it, going to crown himself king. There's an old man in the city, and this old man apparently is in the employ of David. And his name is Nathan. He's a prophet. Nathan is the one who came to David in 2 Samuel chapter 12. And he was the one who told David that he sinned with Bathsheba, and he remember the statement, "Thou art the man." Nathan was a strong prophet of God. And I say he was in the employ of David most likely because remember when David's son by Bathsheba died, as God had said he would. The next son that she had was Solomon. And David named him Shalomah, that is, peaceable one. Solomon means the peaceable one. But it was Nathan, the prophet, who is apparently one who was overseeing his upbringing, who called him instead Jedediah. That simply points to the fact that Nathan was the one overseeing Solomon. So Nathan was in the employ of David, in his household, in his palace. He was also a prophet of God. And Nathan saw what was taking place at En-Rogel. And he knew that this spelled the doom of Israel, because this is the way it's going to go. Not only was it dangerous for the country, but it was dangerous for whom? Himself. It was dangerous for anyone who was in the family of David that was opposed to Adonija. Now, why is that the case? Remember I told you about Zimri and Omri earlier? Well, one of the things that they did always was they not only exterminated the opposing force, but they exterminated all the family. They wanted all the family taken out of the way. So when Omri took the position of leadership in Israel, he destroyed everybody in Zimri's family because there was not going to be any law of primogeniture. No one going to follow Zimri's family. Destroy them all. And that is common practice when you have kings and queens or dictatorships or military dictatorships. You destroy everybody who might be in an opposition position. So Nathan might be one of those who would be exterminated. But it was more than that. He knew that God had made a promise to himself, to David, apparently a palace secret at the time, that it would be Solomon who would be king. And he was concerned that Solomon take his rightful position. So he decides that he needs to do something about it. I want to stop here for a moment and notice what has caused, for example, what has caused all of this problem here? Besides the fact that Adonijah has been the way he is, what has caused all of this? And a lot of it boils down to the fact that David himself was a great leader at one time, but now he was a man who lacked decision-making, decisiveness as a king. He was on his deathbed. He had not pointed out who was going to be king following him, and this lack of decision was absolutely about to destroy the kingdom. I saw this article in Forbes magazine. It was several years ago. It was written. And it was a study of 17,000 executives in companies in America. And they were asking these executives over these companies, what are the success formulas and the failure methods that take place? What are the things that cause failure and the things that cause success in a company? Do you know what they discovered regarding the leadership of the companies? The number one factor, and get this, the number one factor why companies fail as opposed to companies that are successful is because a leader is decisive and makes decisions, even the hard decisions. Even if they're not the best decisions, they make the decision and they learn to live with it. And I really stung on that one because that's one of my weak points is the decision making. And that's exactly what the Forbes magazine pointed out. 17,000 executives. So the point was even this. What matters is a decision is made. That matters more than the quality of the decision. Make a decision and live with it. And that matters more than the quality of the decision. In other words, if you wait and say, I want to put it off and make a better decision, many times that is a failure method. That is a failure formula. General Patton, one of the commander-in-chiefs of our armies in Europe, made this comment. He said, a good decision applied with vigor is better than a perfect decision 10 minutes too late. A good decision applied with vigor is better than a perfect decision applied 10 minutes late. Timing is everything. And that's exactly the way it is here. David was hamstrung in his decision making. And by the way, the Forbes magazine article goes on to point out, how can we learn to be more decisive? Number one, learn to do it in small matters. Just even when you're at a restaurant, you're looking at the menu, say, give yourself some time. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's I'll decide. Here's what I'm going to get. Make small decisions in your lives. That way, give yourself a short time frame to do it. Big decisions, such as if I'm going to move to a different home, sell my house, move to a different state, do something different, change jobs, whatever, those decisions, give yourself a timeline, and it's a hard and fast timeline, say it's going to be made by that particular time. And number three, you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to make decisions that are not the best decisions, but it's better than making no decision at all. But the thing to do is don't look back. There are other decisions to be made. Don't look back. Don't cry about it. Don't whine about it. Don't moan about what you've done in the past and the decisions that was really poor perhaps. Go on. And don't worry about those decisions in the past. It's hard to do, isn't it? So David was indecisive. And that brought on this great, giant, almost catastrophe as it's now beginning to form. It's just like a great big storm cloud rising up in 1 Kings chapter 1. So I want you to think about the peril and the danger that's really about to take place. Not only is it to Nathan because he was, of course, David's confidant. He was his prophet. But Adonija, remember, was one of those individuals, just like other sons of David, who was willing to put the sword to a people who were in opposition to him. So his life was going to be at danger. Not only that, but the promise of God to Solomon, given by Nathan apparently, that Solomon would be king, that was going to be foiled, seemingly. And how about Bathsheba? Her life was going to be in danger too, because anyone whom David considered to be close to him was now going to be exterminated. That's the way it always works. And so all of these things are plaguing Nathan's mind. So he says, we've got to do something about this. So he laid out this plan, this conspiracy, and here's how it's going to work. He goes now to David, but here's how he does it. He first of all gets hold of Bathsheba, David's favorite wife. He says, I want you to do this. I want you to go in to David, and I want you to tell him what is now transpiring at Adonija's feast, that Adonija is crowning himself king, and he is not the one that God had appointed. And as you're telling him what's occurring, I'm going to come in and I'm going to confirm your words. I'll come in after that. And that's exactly what they did. So Bathsheba goes into David's inner chamber. David's still in the sick bed. Abishag, who's there, leaves the room. That's the protocol. And Bathsheba lays it out. Says, David, you promised that Solomon, your son, by me, would be the next king. Right now, as we're speaking, Adonija is coalescing a government behind him, and he's crowning himself king. That, of course, got David's attention. And as she was speaking, in comes Nathan. Nathan also confirms what she has just told him. And he relies upon the following factors. He says, number one, he said, this is a danger to not only myself, Bathsheba, but it's a danger to Solomon, because Solomon was the one that God appointed to be your successor. But Solomon's life now also is in danger. Number two, he points out, look at the methodology that Adonija has used. He has completely disregarded your wishes, taken the control of government on his own initiative. And these are the arguments that Nathan lays in front of him. So David, we're so thankful for this. He awakens from his lethargy, and he now begins to be pretty decisive once again. And here's what he does. Here's how it goes. He said, here's what you're going to do. Number one, you take Solomon and you go to the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Valley of Jehoshaphat, remember, is just north of En Rogel. It's all over there in the Kidron Valley. And you take Zadok, who is the second priest, and take the horn of oil. That's something that Adonija had overlooked. Take the horn of oil, and you're going to anoint Solomon to be king. You're going to announce it in the city and have a large crowd that was gathered there. Anoint him to be king. Then you're going to set him on the king's mule. You would not think that that would be an important factor, putting him on the mule. But that's exactly what it meant. When you ride the king's mule, that means that you are the regal one. You might recall, reaching ahead in history in the book of Esther, remember that Mordecai was set on one of the king's mules or donkeys and led through the town. Remember how that was done? That was actually a signal that he had the pleasure of the king. And that's exactly what this is about. So put him on my mule and set him up, and then we're going to sing, or you're going to chant, "Long live King Solomon." Anoint him with the horn of oil. So Zadok runs to the tabernacle, which is located at Mount Moriah, which is where the temple would later be. Gets the horn of oil. Solomon is taken to the Valley of Jehoshaphat. And there's another factor here that plays an important part. And one thing that Adonijah had overlooked. There's a man by the name of Benaiah. Benaiah was the head of David's bodyguard. The bodyguard numbered 600 people, 600 soldiers. They were called, in the 1 Kings 1, they're called the Crethi and the Pelethi. I don't know which translation you might be using. It might be worded a little bit differently, but apparently that refers to Cretans and Philistines. But these were individuals who had been warriors with David from a long time ago. That is, they were already prepared for fight. They were already prepared for war. They were his bodyguard, and Benaiah was their leader. Remember when David had fled from King Saul years ago, he had a number of people that gathered around him, and some of them were actually Philistine people. They were not all Israelites. And I suppose that they were circumcised and became Jews or became Israelites. But be that as it may, Philistine warriors gathered around David, as well as some Cretans, and they are now a class of bodyguard people, the closest to David, who had been with him all these years, called the Crethi and the Pelethi. So Benaiah is the captain of them. And so the captain, Benaiah, with the Crethi and the Pelethi, are to go with Solomon to guard him and march him through the streets and account him as the king of Israel. And that's exactly what happens. Meanwhile, back at En Rogel, something interesting is taking place. Adonijah is feasting and drinking and declaring himself to be king. And in comes a young man. He is the son of Abiathar. His name is Jonathan. He has just seen what's going on elsewhere. And he has a message for Adonijah. And Adonijah, when he says, "Come on in," he says, "Surely you have good news for me." I want you to think about that for a moment. Neil, no matter what's taking place, Adonijah is filled with himself. And that's what the Bible calls, what's that word? Vanity. Vanity. Do you know who writes about vanity in the Bible more frequently than any other writer? King Solomon himself. Vanity or vainness. Vanity. There are basically two areas of vanity that are pointed out in Scripture. Number one, what is it to be vain or to be one who is afflicted with vanity? You could be having a more highly exalted thought of yourself than really is due you. That is, you think more of yourself than you really ought to. That's vanity. And that's what Adonijah was afflicted with. There's also vanity that is frequently pointed out by Solomon in Ecclesiastes, and that is pursuing things that are very worthless in life. That's what the church is all about today, isn't it? Now, we all have hobbies and all have things that we like to do, extracurricular. But it becomes another matter when those things consume us. And that's all the topic of our conversation. That's all the topic of our interest. That's all what we're about. I grew up playing sports too. But I don't talk about sports. I ride horses. I don't want to talk about it continually all the time, and that's just the only thing that's in my mind that occupies my brain. That's not the most important thing, because when it's all said and done, it doesn't matter at all about any of that stuff. Makes no difference at all. It's all vanity, striving after wind. It's nothing. And that's exactly the way we are in America. The church is all about sports. We canceled church services for the Super Bowl, for crying out loud. What's going on? We are just so much filled with sports, entertainment. It has become a vain show. That's exactly what's happening to the church. That's what Adonija was all about. He was not about those things, striving after wind, but he was striving after wind in this regard. He thought more of himself than he ought to think. He completely was vain. And where did that come about? Because of a lack of honor and respect in the home that he lacked when he was just a child. And now he is filled with himself. And he thinks when Jonathan comes in, it's all going to be great. What is the good news you're going to bring me? It's not good news. It's not good news, Adonija. I'm going to tell you, Jonathan says, I've been at the valley of Jehoshaphat, and here's what's taking place. Now, when he began to speak, there was an older man. He was David's nephew, commander-in-chief of the army. He knew something was amiss. He was even hearing some shouting in the town. And so now as soon as these words come out of Jonathan's mouth, he stands up. He knows what's happening. And that is that someone else has been crowned king. That man is Joab, and he leaves. He's out. And we'll find out what happens to Joab in a successive lesson. The point is this. Every one of them there at the feast were practicing an act of treason. I'm asking you, what is the punishment for treason? The punishment for treason is always the death sentence, isn't it? It's always the death sentence. And that's the way it was here. If you're going to act treasonously, then you have the death sentence. And we haven't done that in America for a long, long time, and we've let treasonous acts just go the way of all the earth, just let everything just slide by. No matter if people are in part of a communist party that says we're going to overthrow the government or not, we just let it go. But treason really deserves the death penalty. And Adonija, Joab, Abiathar, they knew it. They knew. Now they're in a treasonous position. And they begin, that party breaks up just like some grass fire. It's just like you put straw on fire, boom, it's gone. It's hot for a second, and then now it's gone. And they all start dispersing to their homes. But one of the great lessons of the entire chapter is this, and I want to conclude with this one, and that's regarding Solomon. Adonija wants mercy from the king. He deserved what? Death. So he goes to the tabernacle, and the outer court of the tabernacle is the altar of burnt offering where they burn the animals. And there are horns on the altar that they use on the corners of them that they used to tie the animals on there, on the meat. And he grabs the horns of the altar because that now is a place of asylum. And he begs for mercy. And they tell Solomon, who's now the king, that Adonijah is holding on to the horns of the altar, and he's not going to release himself until you give him, grant him clemency and mercy. Solomon could have said what we're going to see later happens with Joab, when Solomon tells Benaiah, who's now his commander-in-chief, says, you go pull him off that altar and you kill him. He could have said that, and that would have been just. But Solomon is a man full of mercy, and he lives up to his name, a peaceable man. He said, you know what? You give him mercy. He is his half-brother. You give him mercy, and you tell him that no harm will come to him as long as you follow these conditions. That is, I'm the king, and we'll see how that works out later. As long as you follow these conditions, then there's not going to be any harm come to him. And I want to point out this, that Solomon, 1,000 years before Jesus Christ, shows us really a Christian disposition. I think about the passage in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus tells us the practice of the Old Testament is this. He said, you've heard of them said of old time, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, pray for them that persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. That is to say, you show your pedigree, who is really your spiritual father, by the way you behave toward people who are not only your friends, your neighbors, your loved ones, your family, but also your enemy. How do you treat your enemies? So Jesus tells you, love your enemies, pray for them that persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes the sun, that is God, he makes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. That is to say, God blesses evil people and the good people. He blesses them all alike. He makes the rain to come upon the just and the unjust. God blesses all alike, and he wants you to be exactly the same. If you salute those who are your brethren only, then what more do you than other people? What do you more than the Gentiles? If you love your brethren only, that is, only you'll love your brothers, what do you more than other people? What more is there in Christianity than what people practice normally in the world? Simply loving the people who are closest to you. No, he says, finally, you shall be perfect even as your Father in heaven is perfect. That is to say, mature in a peaceable disposition. That's what Solomon leaves us with. A man of peace, and we need to be people of peace also. But it begins with not simply loving your neighbor, but loving your enemies also. And blessing them, that means you do good to all people. You're not discriminatory in how you pass out your greetings, how you pass out kindnesses, how you treat people. Should not make a difference whether they're your close friends or your enemy. That's the way Solomon was. What a great example of Solomon. The lesson is yours. 1 Kings chapter 1, Solomon, a man of peace. We want you to come to the front if you're subject to the invitation in any way whatsoever as we stand and sing.